Hi class, this is lecture 15. We're going to talk about a new argument, the problem of suffering. This is based off chapter 4.5, pages 366 to 370 of the textbook. So just to recap, we started to dabble with this argument by looking at the very last argument from class, one of David Hume's criticisms of the design argument. Remember, the design argument said, if you look around, this world looks like it was designed by a perfect creator. Well, if that really is a good argument, doesn't it show that God isn't perfect? You see all these sorts of flaws out there. Birth defects, cancer, natural disasters. Why would a perfect, loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God create these? Remember our definition of an O3 God? The three O's, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, omniscient. Why would that kind of God create a world with so much suffering in it? Well, so this is what's classically referred to as the problem of evil, or as I'm going to refer to it in this set of lectures, the problem of suffering. I think the word evil is a little bit inappropriate here. Evil tends to be referred to as unnecessary or unjustified suffering, sometimes gratuitous suffering, something along the lines of that. So this is an argument that concludes that there is no God. And the nutshell is to do a similar sort of thing that the design argument did. It asks us to look around at the world, and in this case it asks us to look at the negative stuff in the world, in particular all the suffering we see around us, and we see perhaps in our own lives. Why would an all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing God allow all this suffering? Well, the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, suggests that such a God would not allow any of that suffering. So that means there isn't that type of God. If there were such a God, then that God would be stopping all the suffering we see around us. But since that suffering is not being stopped, that suggests there's no God there putting a stop to it. So the book offers a really striking illustration of suffering to try to get us in what unfortunately might be depressing or sad state of mind when thinking about this particular problem. We get to read an excerpt from a novel called The Plague by philosopher, novelist, author, journalist Albert Camus, who wrote in the early half of the 20th century. Starting on page 367, he tells this fictional story in his novel The Plague, where a plague winds up ravaging this particular French town. And there happens to be a priest named Father Panelot. And this priest gives a mighty sermon when the plague first hits town, saying, well, this is God exacting revenge on us. We've all been sinners. We've all fallen short in the eyes of God. God is in some sense punishing the town, doing this thing for us. And this sounds like a pretty decent response as to why God might allow suffering. But the more the plague ravages the town, the more Father Panelot's response seems a bit wanting. And at a particular point in the story, a little boy winds up getting the plague. And if you read, starting on page 367 of the textbook, you can read all the horrific descriptions, accurate descriptions of what does happen if you actually wind up getting a plague as serious as the bubonic plague. A child experiencing this sort of thing will just be wailing and screaming and writhing in pain, just sort of unstopping, incessant pain. The picture on this particular slide is a picture of a child suffering from the bubonic plague. And the problem with Father Panelot's first response, that this plague is brought upon us because we've been wicked and the town has been sinning and we're being punished by God. Well, the problem with that response is that the boy seems completely innocent. The boy who has this plague hasn't really been even given a chance to live a life yet, let alone to live a life of badness, of sin or evil. So it doesn't seem that God would punish such an innocent boy. Why would God punish that particular child who's just innocent, hasn't been given a chance at all to live life yet? Well, at this point, Father Panelot retracts his initial explanation for what's going on in the town, and he retreats to a somewhat more common explanation, or maybe it's a non-explanation, for what's going on in the town. It amounts to an explanation that's something like, God works in mysterious ways. God must have some sort of reason, we just don't understand what that reason is. And at a certain point, there's this one really dramatic scene, if you turn to page 367, where Father Panelo is talking to the doctor, who's named Dr. Rue, and Dr. Rue has been treating all these patients who have the plague, the boy included. And Dr. Rue is much more skeptical of these religious claims that there's a God allowing the suffering. Dr. Rue seems to be hardened and absolutely sort of traumatized by the plague's damage to everyone in the town that he's treated. And Panelu and Dr. Rue are talking to each other, and at a certain point, Father Panelu runs this type of reasoning by Dr. Rue. He says, well, maybe we don't understand what's going on here to this particular boy, but perhaps we should love what we can't understand. And Dr. Rue seems really upset at this type of response. He thinks this is a horrific response. And he says, I shall refuse to love a scheme of things in which children are put to torture. And that really is the essence of this problem of suffering. Why is it that bad things happen to seemingly good people? Why do innocent people suffer? Why do good people suffer? Why do innocent beings and creatures at all experience such horrific, seemingly unnecessary, unjustified suffering? Think about it. Unfortunately, I'm asking you to think about and ponder really, really depressing things in the world. But children literally do starve to death. People get cancer for no seemingly explicable reason. People are burnt to death relatively frequently, far more than I would recommend happening. People die and suffer in hurricanes. There are car accidents that happen for seemingly random reasons that result in horrific suffering and death. And that's not even to mention any of the animals out there that suffer as much as they do. Animals also suffer from forest fires. Animals suffer in hurricanes. All these sorts of things. Why would a loving, fair, just God allow all this in our world? The particular picture in the top right corner of this slide is a picture of Pompeii, which is the famous incident where the volcano right above Pompeii erupted unexpectedly, and the citizens were all caught in the middle of doing whatever it is they were doing, unable to run away from that horrible natural disaster. So much of this suffering just seems unnecessary. It seems like our world would be a much better place without it. That suffering doesn't seem to serve any obvious purpose. It doesn't seem to make sense that a God who sat down, thought about it, and created this world would create a world with this much suffering in it. So there's a bunch of different versions of this problem of suffering argument. The first and probably most common version of it is what's typically called a logical version, because it tries to offer a fairly deductive version that just says all these premises logically show us guarantee that there is no God. And in a sense, it's trying to point out that the standard qualities we attribute to God are literally inconsistent or incompatible with the existence of suffering in our world. Let's run through those big three qualities that we give to God. We say that God is all-powerful, and that means God is capable of stopping all the suffering. God is also all-knowing, according to our O3 definition. That means God is aware of all the suffering that's out there. God's super smart, knows about all of it. And God is supposed to be all-good. That means God wants to stop all the suffering that exists out there. If you're a good person and you see something suffering, you see someone suffering for no good reason, you would naturally want to put a stop to that suffering. So if you add all three of these points up, it seems like a God that has all these qualities would stop all the suffering in our world.